Hello and welcome. This is the First Unitarian Universalist Church's Public Affairs Forum. My name is Luther Elmore. Every Sunday we hold these forums to further the mission of the church. That is to gather in community, to nourish souls, to transform lives, and do justice. And we seek to have these forums to further those ends. We've been conducting these services, these public affairs forums, since 1954, the year this church was organized and incorporated. And I was just telling Bob that the very first speaker we ever had was Ronnie Duggar from the Texas Observer. He was the first person who ever gave one of these forums in a long tradition of people who have spoken to us. We do hold these meetings virtually every Sunday except for the dead of summer, in which we take a couple of months break. For information about them, you can go online to our church website, austinuu.org. Today our presenter is Bob Libal. Bob is Executive Director of Grassroots Leadership. This is a nationally recognized civil and human rights organization now based in Austin, Texas. Grassroots Leadership fights for a more just society and seeks to end prison profiteering and reduce reliance on criminalization and direct detention. They use direct action, organizing, research, and public education. Beginning as a broadly based civil rights organization in North Carolina in 1980, Grassroots Leadership now focuses on one of the most egregious civil rights issues of our times, mass incarcerations of Americans. The United States contains 5% of the world's population, and yet we house 25% of the world's prisoners. Bob himself has worked for more than a decade on prison privatization, immigration detention, and criminal justice reform. Today he will discuss the current crisis in our immigration and detention policies and what we might expect from the current Trump administration. Bob, we welcome you to us today. Thank you very much.
So thanks so much, Luther and First UU, for having me back in hearing about next week's forum. I'm going to try to, I guess, probably be equally depressing today in discussing mass incarceration and deportation in the era of the Trump administration. But I'm going to try to also leave with some hope and resilience and resistance. So as Luther said, Grassroots Leadership is a national organization now based here in Austin, working for a more just world where things like prison profiteering and mass incarceration, deportation, criminalization of communities are a thing of the past. And our work falls fairly squarely at the intersection and in the arenas of criminal justice reform and immigration reform. So what that looks like in the criminal justice arena is we fight for policies that close troubled for-profit prisons in Texas. We have programs that build the capacity and leadership of formerly incarcerated people to advocate for reforms, firmly believing that those who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. And fighting for policies like a fair chance policy so that people who have re-entered society after being incarcerated or after a criminal conviction have the chance to get a job, right? Have the chance to have housing. And we were very proud to be involved in the effort here in Austin that resulted in Austin becoming the first fair chance hiring city in the country, or in the southern United States. Our immigration work similarly is both policy and organizing and advocacy. So many members of this congregation have been involved in our Hutto visitation program, where we train volunteers to go out to the Teton Hutto Detention Center outside of Austin and visit women who are detained there, asylum-seeking women. We have been very involved in the effort nationally and here in Texas to fight the practice of locking up immigrant children and their mothers in family detention camps in South Texas. including suing the state of Texas to successfully block the state from labeling these facilities child care centers in an effort to keep them open. We're one of the proud founding members, along with First UU, of the Austin Sanctuary Network, the network of congregations and nonprofit organizations in Austin that have come together to provide sanctuary to immigrants who are in deportation proceedings. Another project that we've been working on as of late is a Sanctuary in the Streets training curriculum, where we're training community members, particularly those based in congregations, to peacefully and prayerfully respond in an act of deportation, to actually go out and put our bodies between deportation agents and members of our community who are in the crisis of an immediate deportation. And across our program areas, we work to try to expose and undo the role of the for-profit prison industry in our nation's criminal justice and immigration systems. So through a series of reports and media, really trying to shine a light on the role that these companies have played in developing and profiting from and maintaining and expanding our system of mass incarceration and immigration detention in this country. So I'm here today to talk about mass incarceration and deportation in the era of Donald Trump. It's not good news, as folks can probably imagine. But I want to take a step back and talk about some of the policies that have gotten us to the point where we are, and then talk about what some of the challenges are that we're going to be facing that may be unique in this era. And then I want to leave on some notes of hope. I hope, right? And thinking about how communities, right, particularly at the very local level, can fight back against many of these policies that are so detrimental to so many people. So as Luther said, we are a society that uses incarceration and exclusion, right, through immigration policies like no other country in the history of the world. We have more people behind bars than any country in the history of the world. We have racial disparities, right, in our criminal justice and in our immigration system that are profound, right? In state prisons in the United States, an African American is 5 times more likely to be locked up than a white person. And those numbers become even more egregious when you start talking about things like the war on drugs, when you start talking about drug crimes, where African Americans and white folks both use and distribute drugs at roughly equal rates, and yet African Americans are something like 9 times more likely to be locked up for a drug offense in the United States than a white person. And, you know, we've really turned to the concept, right, of locking people up to deal with almost any of our social issues in this country. It has really become normalized. We use incarceration to deal incarceration, and I would say on the front end, criminalization, right? The sort of the use of police and then the warehousing of people in prison or prison-like facilities to deal with, you know, nearly every social issue in this country, from homelessness to poverty to addiction to immigration to mental illness. The point, right, where many of our largest mental health facilities in this country are actually places of incarceration, right? The single largest mental health facility in the state of Texas is the Harris County Jail, right? And if that doesn't tell us something about both the state of our treatment of mental illness, right, in this community and how we use incarceration to respond to social crises, I don't know what does. And on immigration, we have a similar story, right? Well, and I guess I would say on both criminal justice and on immigration, I also want to paint a picture that while we have normalized, right, these practices of using incarceration and using deportation in a mass system, that it hasn't always been like this, right? That this is not a historical reality, and it does not always have to be like this, right? If you just go back 40 years in this country, right, our incarceration rates have been fairly steady, right, for for a decade. We had something like 250,000 people locked up in the United States, in the entire United States, at the beginning of the 1970s. And then we saw this enormous boom in incarceration throughout, really beginning with the declaration of the war on drugs, right, in the Nixon administration, the escalation of that war, and the criminalization and the policies like mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing, these policies that led to the rapid expansion of our criminal justice system and of our prison system in the United States throughout the 1980s and throughout the 1990s. And the immigration story is similar, I would say, right? We reached a record number of deportations in 2014 in the Obama administration, right? And the numbers have fallen a little bit in 2016, but we deported 435,000 people in just the year 2014. And 3 million people in the 8 years of the Obama administration. 3 million people. Right, that's an incredible amount of people, and folks who are part of this congregation, right, are very familiar with some of those stories, right? Folks like Sulma, who took sanctuary here to avoid deportation and who came to the United States fleeing persecution because of her sexual orientation. Folks like Hilda and Yvonne, who've been living at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, who came here fleeing persecution because of the place in Guatemala that they live and their identity. And also long-term permanent residents of the United States are swept up in immigration proceedings, right? I think that there is somewhat of a misconception at times that immigrants, often you hear the other side say, well, what part of illegal don't you understand, right? And one response, I think there's a much deeper response to the unjustness of our laws and the need to challenge those laws. But one response to that is that Solma and Hilda and Yvonne all came and went through the proper processes to seek asylum in this country, right? That was a legal channel. There are also people who are caught up in the immigration system who are long-term legal permanent residents of the United States. And an example I use is of our board member, Hope, and her husband, Naz, in Waco. Naz had lived here since he was 8 years old as a legal permanent resident of the United States. When he was a teenager, he had issues of addiction and was accused of and pled guilty to some criminal offenses related to his addiction. He got probation, and because he pled guilty to the crimes, and did everything you would want somebody who's involved in the criminal justice system to do. He became a leader in Narcotics Anonymous. He became a leader in an organization in Waco called Mission Waco, volunteering with the church under the bridge, right, sort of feeding homeless folks on Sunday afternoons. He met this wonderful social work student at Baylor named Hope. They got married at the church under the bridge. They were trying to start a family, and a few months after they're married, immigration agents came to their door at 7 a.m. and took Naz away to an immigration detention center, where he spent a year in an immigration detention center in South Texas, operated by a for-profit prison company, as the government was attempting to deport him for a criminal conviction that was almost a decade old. He had never spent any time in jail for this criminal conviction, and Naz would have absolutely been deported if it wasn't for a brilliant organizing campaign that his wife put together on his behalf. So there are a broad spectrum of people who end up caught up in the immigration system, much in the same way that there are a broad spectrum of people who get caught up in the criminal justice system. And I think I also want to note that there's been an industry that has been built up around this, right? Naz was put in a for-profit detention center that was operated by a private prison corporation called the GEO Group. The group used to be called Wackenhut Corrections Corporation, and the GEO is one of two large for-profit prison companies that are publicly traded. The other is now called Core Civic, which formerly was known as Corrections Corporation of America. but the brand got so toxic that they thought they needed to change it. And these companies, we still call them Corrections Corporation of America, CCA and GO, have churned people's pain, right? They've churned the incarceration of hundreds of thousands of Americans and the detention of tens of thousands of immigrants on any given day into a huge business, a multi-billion-dollar business. Combined, the companies have more than $4 billion in annual revenue, and they turn around and invest that money in campaign contributions and lobbying expenditures to ensure that their interests are met. And while they swear up and down that they don't lobby on issues related to sentencing or immigration, they occasionally get caught. And one way we've caught them recently is we did a report in 2015 which demonstrated that these companies gave their federal lobbying was almost exclusively focused on the members of Congress who were on the Appropriations Committee, and that it was the Appropriations Committee that sets an immigration detention bed quota that says that there can be no fewer than 34,000 immigrants in detention on any given day. Now think about that for a minute, right? That there's a quota that says that the number of immigrants who are detained cannot fall below a certain level, and that quota is being lobbied for by for-profit prison corporations that have a direct incentive to maintain high levels of detention. That's a pretty bleak picture. So things were bad before. But I would note that at least before November 8th, the political foundation on which our mass incarceration policies and our mass detention policies were built was really shaking. That we had a system that even the way that we speak about these policies, 10 years ago, if you heard somebody say the words mass incarceration, they were probably somebody who worked for a criminal justice reform organization. If you heard somebody say, this is like Jim Crow, right? This is like the new Jim Crow. They were somebody who was, far out on the political spectrum, right? A racial justice activist, right? Things have changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And that political foundation, that sort of consensus that harsh criminal justice policies and harsh immigration policies are absolutely the way to go. Really, there's been a break in that consensus. And some evidence of that, I would say, is that our federal prison population has fallen by almost 25,000 people just in the last 4 years. That's a big deal for a population that was continuing to spike. And the reason for that is varied, right? But it includes reforms to drug sentencing guidelines that the Obama administration pushed through. It includes a slight downtick in the criminal prosecution of immigrants at the border. And it also includes an announcement in August of last year that the federal government would phase out its use of for-profit private prisons in the Federal Bureau of Prisons system. We'll get to what's happened to that in the last few days in a minute. And I would say an additional way that we can measure, right, that this consensus has been broken, that we should continue to build prisons, that we should continue to lock people up to deal with our social issues, is that state prison populations have also fallen in the last several years. And even here in Texas, right? In Texas, we incarcerate more people than any other state in the country. We have one of the highest incarceration rates, only behind states like Louisiana and Mississippi and Oklahoma, not states you want to be at the top of social indicators lists with. But even here in Texas, our prison population, thanks to really hard-fought reforms, has fallen slightly, right, in the last several years. But it's fallen significantly enough that the state's been able to close 3 prisons in the last 3 legislative sessions. And we're actually looking at a fairly big reform to criminal justice that was just introduced this past week that would defelonize a whole sort of category of low-level felonies here in Texas, And actually, we may be able to close 1 or 2 prisons in this legislative session, even in this current environment. And I think that one of the reasons for that change is that there has been a growing bipartisan support for criminal justice reform. It's been the emergence of conservatives for criminal justice reform, a right on crime movement. And while I think that there are limitations to how far many of these folks are willing to go to undo the crisis that was really created out of this law and order frame, I do think that we are at a sort of interesting moment, right, where until November 8th, at least I would say, that we had a system where no one, like a political system where very few people were saying what we should be doing is locking up more people. And on the immigration front, I think we also have seen progress despite the record numbers of people who were deported in the Obama administration. And I think some evidence for that is if you look at the election and you look at the ways in which the campaigns took on varying positions, we really saw the Clinton campaign take on a number of positions that were far more progressive than the Obama campaign ever took on, right? So, for instance, the Clinton campaign, really responding to grassroots organizing and advocacy, took on the position that we should end the practice of detaining immigrant families. The Clinton campaign also took on the position that we should not detain immigrants in for-profit prisons. These were all direct responses to years of organizing and advocacy, right, from grassroots immigrant rights organizations, including grassroots leadership and others, but it really represented a shift, right, from the policies that have really guided even the conversation around comprehensive immigration reform for more than a decade, which is that you don't criticize the detention apparatus, right, that you don't criticize the deportation apparatus in an effort to win legalization for some of the people who are here. And I would also say that another measure of where things are is how strong is a movement. And I will say that working pretty firmly in the criminal justice reform movement and in the immigrant rights movement, that we have stronger, increasingly better resourced, bolder and more strategic immigration and criminal justice reform organizations than we've had in the past. And so as we move into this era of Trump, or as we are firmly in this era of Trump, I think that that's one of the things that will give me hope for us moving forward, is really that we have strong, bold, strategic, and better resourced organizations to really be able to fight back against what is coming. So what is coming, or what is here? As I think, like many of you, I was fairly shocked by what happened on November 8th. Donald Trump obviously ran a campaign that was based largely on racist attacks on immigrants, a really retrograde rhetoric around law and order, right? Something that we haven't seen, really at least since Reagan, and maybe even since Nixon, I mean, using rhetoric that was, obviously considered out of the mainstream and out of bounds in many ways. And it really draws on a long history that Trump has, right, of racial antagonism, of racial scapegoating, going back to, at least the 1980s, particularly in the criminal justice arena, when Trump took out full-page ads calling for the return of the death penalty in the case of the Central Park jogger case, in which 5 African-American men spent a long period of time in prison after being wrongfully convicted, it turns out, of sexually assaulting a white woman. So, so I think that there was certainly a precursor of what the policies may look like in the campaign, right, through the rhetoric. But there was also a thought that, campaign rhetoric may be something very different than policy. But during the transition period, I think that we saw many reasons to think that, in fact, the policies may be as bad or perhaps even worse, right, than the campaign rhetoric was. One of Trump's key advisors, right, in the transition, and I don't know if he has an official position in Homeland Security, but is Chris Kobosh. I don't know if people are familiar with this person, but he's kind of like the immigration Steve Bannon, right? He's been working for more than a decade to put the policy in the anti-immigrant movement. So he's actually the Attorney General of the state of Kansas, who's been very involved in figuring out how he can prosecute even a few people for voter fraud and then draw a line between those few people that have been prosecuted for voter fraud to sort of say that undocumented immigrants are the people who are committing the voter fraud, which is not true at all, right? Actually, the 5 cases in Kansas are all older white folks who voted in multiple states being confused about their absentee ballots, basically.
But Chris Kobosh is also the person who was the legal mind behind SB 1070 in Arizona, which was the law that the Papers, Please law that essentially gave police the authority and, in fact, the mandate to enforce immigration law on the local level. So, certainly Chris Kobosh being involved in these conversations made us wary that what was going to come could be actually as bad as some of the campaign promises. And then I think that we've seen, certainly on the immigration front, in the series of executive orders that have come down over the last couple of weeks, really the fulfillment of many of those very, very harsh campaign promises. Some of the executive orders and the subsequent memos from Homeland Security providing guidance to Immigration and Customs Enforcement in particular. Some of the provisions include making all undocumented immigrants a priority, right, for deportation, sort of undoing any of the prioritization that the Obama administration had put on folks. Certainly the first wave of immigration enforcement actions have been, I think, clearly to send a message. What we saw here in Austin, we were one of, a half a dozen cities or so where immigration enforcement agents descended on our community, right, and terrorized people in our community over the course of a long weekend. Our community defense hotline, the hotline that people call in crisis, got over 1,000 calls and texts that weekend, responding to the raids that took more than 50 Austin community members away over that weekend. The executive orders add 10,000 immigration agents, mostly to be focused on immigration removal operations. So it's not sort of the back end, right? It's like deportation forces and 5,000 Border Patrol agents. And the 10,000 immigration agents is a really huge number because ICE, as a department, only has 19,000 employees and only has 5,800 removal officers. So it's essentially a tripling of the removal operations forces. Now, how they're going to fund that, I think, is another question. So Congress is going to have to approve that. So if you are, if you are doing congressional advocacy right now, and I know that many people are, please bring this up. Particularly if your Congress people are very involved in immigration issues. For instance, Mike McCall, who I think probably represents this church, is the chair of the Homeland Security Department in Congress and is a very powerful voice on these issues and has not been a good voice on these issues thus far. The executive orders greatly expand detention of immigrants through a couple of mechanisms. It essentially expands the category of people who can be
detained indefinitely. It expands expedited removal of immigrants, which essentially says that folks will be detained up until their immigration proceedings are disposed of. And one of the estimates that I've seen is that it will be a doubling of immigration detention capacity, which essentially means that there will be a whole bunch of new prisons here in Texas designed to incarcerate immigrants. And it also, the executive orders greatly expand the use of the criminal justice system, right, to apprehend immigrants by expanding the definition of who is a criminal to include, nearly anyone who is in the country without authorization. It also expands local law enforcement collaboration with immigration and customs enforcement by bringing back the really detrimental program called Secure Communities, which is essentially the jail dragnet program, right, where undocumented immigrants, if they have any interaction with law enforcement, are going to be subject to deportation. And it also threatens to punish so-called sanctuary cities, right, through the withdrawal of funds. So I think that what we've done here in Travis County, right, with the progressive policy that Sheriff Hernandez has taken related to immigration is so much more important now, because there is going to be no prioritization of anyone who has any contact with local law enforcement who could be booked into the jail, regardless of offense, right? If it's a warrant on a traffic ticket, right? Those people are all going to be high priorities for deportation, right? So what Sheriff Hernandez has done here, responding to the local advocacy, is even more important today. And on criminal justice issue, last Thursday, it's kind of like there's one terrible thing every day, it seems like, at least one. And on Thursday, Attorney General Sessions revoked the guidance to the Bureau of Prisons, taking back the memo that Sally Yates had written, saying we were going to phase out private prisons in the federal prison system. There's a couple reasons why I think that's important. One is it demonstrates that this administration has very close ties and is going to be very responsive to the for-profit prison industry. Actually, two of Sessions' top aides immediately after the election went to work for a private prison corporation as lobbyists. So I think we're going to see very tight relationships between both the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security and the private prison industry. And I think that one of the other things that it does is it really signals that, because the way that we are going to be able to phase out the use of for-profit prisons in a 5-year time period was by continuing the trend of criminal justice reforms, by continuing to lower the amount of people who are locked up for things like drug crimes, for things like immigration crimes. I think that this is a signal that that trend is going to end and that it could actually reverse. And I think that the appointment of Jeff Sessions to Attorney General really is another indicator of that. Jeff Sessions in the Senate was one of the biggest obstacles to even bipartisan criminal justice reform. And, it's been well told in the media, right, that he was rejected to a federal bench seat, right, back in the 1980s because of ties to racially discriminatory organizations and racist things that he had said in the past, right? And so I think that signals, right, that if the head of the Department of Justice is going to be a criminal justice reform obstacle, that we're probably in for a long, 4 years in terms of what criminal justice reform may look like. And if private prison stocks are any indicator of where things are going, CNN reported last week that they're up 100% since the election. So that's pretty bleak, right? So, it's been a long couple weeks, I think, probably for everybody. We're only a month in, I think, to this administration. But I actually feel somewhat hopeful, which seems strange, given what we're up against. And I think that the reason that I feel hopeful is twofold. One, it is because the local organizing efforts, right, here in Travis County and in Austin, but also all across the country, have seen an outpouring, like a true tidal wave of support, right? And I mean that both in terms of the volunteers who are calling to sign up. I mean that in terms of people who are actively participating for the very first time. Our office literally cannot keep up with the emails and phone calls that we're getting for people to volunteer and to people to get involved. And I would say that we're plugging those people into concrete ways that both can stop deportations and we hope will grow into a broader pro-immigrant movement. And a couple of those ways, right, this congregation has been intimately involved in. It's been really inspiring to see the growth of the sanctuary movement in churches and in other places around, certainly around Austin and also around the country. I think there are now 18 congregations and more every day, right, who have signed up to be a part of the Austin Sanctuary Network. And we're getting calls from around the state and around the country asking, how do we do this as well? And it's places like Houston and Georgetown, but it's also places like Waco and Nacogdoches, right, where churches are calling us and saying, we want to open ourselves up to sanctuary, and how do we do it, and what are the steps? We've also had hundreds of people sign up for our Sanctuary in the Streets trainings, which are trainings to train congregants and others to prayerfully and peacefully disrupt a deportation in process, right? To commit an act of civil disobedience. For us, those of us who have the privilege of being American citizens, right, to put our bodies on the line to stop one of our community members from being deported. And I know that many people in this room have gone through that training. And I also think that another reason that I'm hopeful is that local communities, and by that I mean both the organized resistance and organizers and advocates, but also local elected officials are standing up in a way that we haven't seen them stand up before. Local policies are going to be the future for at least the next 2 years, right? And probably for the next 4 years. We don't have power in Washington right now. We don't have the ability to impact the federal, certainly the administration, and probably not Congress, at least in a particularly meaningful way. And so the local policies that we adopt here are going to be incredibly important. And I've been really heartened by seeing our local officials here in Travis County and increasingly in other parts, right, of the state stand up to the federal government and increasingly stand up to the state government as they try to bully us out of doing the right thing. And I think another reason to be hopeful is that much of this change happens locally, right? Federal immigration is obviously mostly a federal issue, but the ability to impact the way that federal immigration policy impacts a community almost always flows through some sort of local entity, whether it's a jail policy, whether it's a city policy. Similarly, criminal justice is largely a local and state issue, right? It's largely a local and state issue. If you look at the people incarcerated in the United States, 85% of people incarcerated are in state or local prisons or jails. And I think that we have enormous ability to continue to influence that debate, particularly on a local level. We'll be putting out a report and doing an advocacy campaign here in Travis County to try to lower our jail population and lower the number of people that we're sending to state prisons, which is higher than it should be. And also, there continues to be opportunity at the state level to reform the criminal justice system. That is not dead yet. And there's some really terrific legislation that's moving through the state legislature that, as I mentioned earlier, would reduce felony penalties for a broad scope of people. And we believe that during this legislative session, we'll be able to close at least one additional prison, hopefully a private prison here in Texas. And so I think I'll close by saying, I've been thinking a lot about this quote, so I looked it up this morning. The Dr. King quote that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, which upon reading upon it, Dr. King was quoting a Unitarian, 19th century Unitarian minister, Theodore Parker. And there's a lot of debate online because since President Obama has sort of taken this quote and used it about the context in which Dr. King was employing it, and whether or not he meant the arc of history will inevitably bend towards justice or not. And the context of the quote is that no, it won't, right? That it takes those of us who are working for justice to bend that arc, right? And so that's given me some hope and some reflection in recent days that it's not inevitable that the arc of history will bend towards justice, but it's our job to bend it. And I am more hopeful now than ever that we are going to accomplish that together. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Bob. And now we'll take some questions.
My question has to do with divestment and whether or not Grassroots leadership is looking at any sort of campaign, or if you perhaps even have something going already that would involve divestment of these for-profit prisons.
Yeah, there has been, so the question is about divestment from private prisons, and that's actually, I got involved in doing this work a long time ago now as a student at the University of Texas, working on a divestment campaign, a student divestment campaign. And in recent years, there's actually been a real resurgence of divestment from private prison advocacy that's gained quite a bit of momentum on campuses in particular, but also with denominations and congregations. So for instance, the United Methodist Church both divested all of its holdings in private prisons and put a screen on future investments. It added incarceration to a list of other things that it won't invest in, so like weapons, tobacco, pornography, right? There's sort of like 4 or 5 things that are broad categories. What we found with divestment is that I think it's a very good organizing tool, right? And I think that it sends a very clear and strong message that institutions refuse to invest in these in for-profit incarceration. Increasingly, we found, and you may have found this in your advocacy work as well. Increasingly, we found that when an entity divests a less sort of transparent, a more obscure, like hedge fund or something, just kind of steps in its place, right? So we haven't found the impact on stock prices to be particularly meaningful, right? And the impact on the industry itself to be particularly meaningful. That said, I think it is a strategy to engage institutions and to really draw a bright line on where institutions are willing to put their money. So I think it's worth the while. I don't think it's a strategy that's going to undermine the industry.
I'm trying to understand why what you said, and we know it, the United States being the highest rate of incarceration and the largest number of people for a country in the world. Does that go back to our, I guess racism's as good a word as any, in which we wiped out the indigenous people when Europeans came over here, and we also, with slavery, got the idea inculcated in the minds of the people that we have to be afraid, basically have fear of the other? Why is this country in this condition?
I mean, I think that the rise of mass incarceration in the United States is a direct descendant of, it's a direct legal descendant, right, of enslavement of black folks, right? The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery for all people except those convicted of crimes. And where you see the dramatic increase in incarceration in this country, it comes on the heels of the abolition of legal discriminatory policies in Jim Crow, right? And so, there are a lot of people who have written and put together things that are much more eloquent than what I would have to say, but I think that the rise of the use of the criminal justice system as a punitive and clearly racially discriminatory policy, right, has everything to do not with crime and what are rational responses to crime, and everything to do with our with a response that is based on how do we control certain groups of people, right, and particularly African American people. I think I think that maybe even here there was a study group on the new Jim Crow, right, which really has struck a nerve with folks. Michelle Alexander's book that traces a sort of lineage of criminal justice policy and racially discriminatory legal policies through Jim Crow. 13th, which was an Academy Award nominated documentary that came out this year, is an excellent look at the role of the 13th Amendment and really the rise of mass incarceration in the context of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and ongoing sort of struggles for racial justice. So I think, to make a sort of long spiel short, our mass incarceration policies had very little to do with responses to crime. I think that responses to crime are used as a way to broaden the net of social control in ways that damage particularly communities of color. And I think that increasingly there is a recognition of that. And I think certainly in seeing the shift amongst, and the rise of mass incarceration was a bipartisan project, right? I mean, this was something that happened in the 80s and 90s, right? This was something that happened under Republican and Democratic administrations and Congresses. But I think we have increasingly seen a recognition that many of those policies were deeply, deeply flawed. And I think we need to continue to sort of raise that alarm that these are extremely flawed policies that are based not on how they make our communities safer. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that incarcerating people makes us less safer, but are really designed as mechanisms of social control over certain people, particularly African Americans. So I'm sorry, you were right.
Will you tell us here in the room today and the people who are going to be watching this broadcast how folks can support this movement, and particularly your organization? Give us some specific ways to help, won't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Richard. So we have a number of projects where we need people. The Sanctuary in the Streets trainings, although they've actually been filling up as of late, which is a great problem to have. And the Hutto Visitation Program are both concrete ways that people in the Austin community can get involved. We also have other opportunities for people to get involved. We certainly take donations, and almost all of these projects are on our website, which is grassrootsleadership.org. You can also call our office, which is 512-499-8111.
Bob, I've seen in the last couple of days where there's talk about possibly criminalizing those people who would provide sanctuary. Mm-hmm. What is the reality that might become law, and then what would it do to places like this church and others who do try to provide sanctuary and assistance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a response to a court case that overturned a state law related to harboring undocumented immigrants. I think The short answer is that this isn't resolved, right? That there's going to be continued sort of legal challenges to it. And my understanding was that also the court ruling narrowed the scope of who could be prosecuted under state law under these harboring provisions. That said, so I think there's the concern about the state law, and there's going to be ongoing legal challenges, and we'll see where that ends up. I also, though, I think that there is a very good chance that the federal government, right, is going to start enforcing some of the federal harboring laws and smuggling laws, right, in very broad ways. And so we have yet to see that, right, in the United States, at least in the modern era of sanctuary. But it's certainly not outside of the realm of possibility. And I think my response to that would be that we need to have hundreds of sanctuaries, not dozens, both so that our immigrant community members who are at risk of deportation have places to go, and also because they can't come for us all, right? Sort of like the Dr. King strategy of, fill the jails until they can't put any more people in the jails, right? We have a lot more jails now, unfortunately, but I think the stronger the sanctuary movement is at the point at which they try to enforce these laws, the harder it is going to be for them to actually bring many prosecutions. So that would be my response. We need more sanctuaries, not less.
Bob, I'm wondering if you were going to write an editorial on Obama's legacy on immigration, what would you say?
That's a good one. I think that President Obama fell into a trap that was created long before him. And that trap was that if we show that we're tough on certain immigrants, then Republicans will compromise with us and will pass an immigration reform bill, right? That I think was a flawed logic in many ways. And perhaps mostly because even that immigration reform bill that was going to come was going to include, legalization for some people and then hyper enforcement, right, on the back end. So like more border patrol, like more militarized border and more ICE agents, in broad terms. And the result of that faulty logic, right, was that millions of people got deported through discretionary programs. That is a big failure, I think, and obviously devastated, hundreds of thousands of people's lives, millions of people's lives, who wouldn't have been deported otherwise had he not taken a sort of a tough stance at the beginning of his administration. But I think it's also complicated, right, because this administration, responding to pressure from Dreamers, right, created DACA, right, which even today still survives, right? So I know countless people who are beneficiaries of DACA and have been able to work, right, for the first time with authorization in sort of the formal sort of system, and so I think that it's a complicated legacy, but I think the big picture is there was a failure on the front end to realize that throwing hundreds of thousands of people to deportation proceedings wasn't actually going to get you the policy goal that you wanted. And I think in the immigration advocacy community, there is no longer the stomach for those kind of compromises, right? That people are not willing to say, we'll go along with the legalization of some people in an effort to, if it comes with the deportation of others, right? So I think maybe the immigration advocacy community and I think progressive elected officials are stronger on these issues than we were 8 years ago.
So we've been speaking more about the immigration side, but how about the outlook for the criminal justice reform and mass incarceration for non-immigrants? And, I mean, even from a financial point of view, spending so much money on the immigration side, it's just, you know, we're going to run out of money putting everybody in jail. So maybe there'll be even some Republican move to keep that going forward.
Yeah, I think I certainly, because criminal justice reform is such a diffuse issue, right? I mean, it comes from states and localities broadly, right? I think that there's a lot more hope for us to make some really significant progress in the next few years. Even locally, you know, here, but also in places like Harris County and Houston, like there's significant reforms that are taking place even right now, right? The new district attorney in Harris County has changed some discretionary policies related to arrests of people on low-level drug offenses, which could have a really profound impact even on our state prison population, because small changes in Harris County, like, you know, you move the dial a little bit in Harris County and suddenly it's like thousands of people, right, who are impacted. You know, and the new sheriff in Harris County has also ended, say, their federal collaboration on immigration enforcement, not like we have, but ended the actual deputizing of local law enforcement agents as immigration enforcers. So I think there's a lot of hope on a local level. And then, of course, at the state level, I think that there still continues to be some momentum related to changing some of these laws, actually using the budget crisis, right, as a way to say, one way you can save money, right, is to reform the criminal justice system and actually close some of these prisons that we're spending billions of dollars on. My colleague, Holly Kirby, and our board chair, Nicole Porter, actually had an op-ed in the Houston Chronicle yesterday, I think, basically saying exactly that, right, that we have the ability to have some progressive innovations given this budget crisis right now. So I do think that there's a lot of ability to move things in the criminal justice arena, whereas I think on the immigration side, we're really in a moment of resistance, right? Not an ability to change policies.
Bob, thank you very much for your presentation, your time today.